Hi, it's Lisa. I always encourage people to have the real conversation, but that's not always that easy. I was coaching a client the other day, and she's having an issue with her boss. Now, it's something that she really needed help with in order to address it. And what was interesting was when she was explaining to me what the issue was, she was clear, she was specific, and I could really hear what the impact was. And there was a business impact here. So the interesting thing was, why was she struggling to tell her boss? Because as far as I was concerned, she presented it beautifully. It's avoidance, right? She was avoiding having that conversation that really needed to be had. Let's talk first about why having the real conversation is so important. Open and honest communication is essential to collaborating well. There's a tendency when you're not having the real conversation, you're avoiding it, there becomes a wedge that grows between you and the person you should be having that conversation with. That might be building resentment or frustration. It might be a spiral of their behavior doesn't totally make sense to you, and then because you're sort of reacting to the behavior that you see that doesn't make sense to you, that you start behaving in a way that doesn't totally make sense, and so that person starts to think, why are they behaving this way? And it can be it can actually wreck relationships at work. The other thing is, of course, the underlying issue doesn't get fixed or resolved. And so when you're avoiding something, you're really being ineffective in that way. Let's talk for a minute about why it's so hard to have that real conversation. Computers are programmed to take in and manage data. But humans have evolved to take in information and make immediate interpretations of that. We build stories. That's how we manage data. The interesting thing is that interpretation has helped us to become the incredible creatures that we are, but it creates tons of difficulty. It's that creates bias and xenophobia and those kinds of things, but it also just creates difficulty with communicating with other Homo sapiens. Our brain's affinity for stories creates two different issues. One is that we see behavior, that data from the environment, and we interpret it or make assumptions about the reason for that behavior. That's the story. We may want to talk with the person who's behaving, but we get bogged down in the story of why they're behaving that way. The other place that story creation can get in our way of good communication is when we hear feedback or when someone comes to us to discuss an issue that we feel strongly about. We hear the words and the tone that the person says, or we see through body language, data. That's all just data, but we build a story around it. And that is how we interpret and make assumptions about this person coming to us with this conversation. I want to be really, really clear here. Our story is always wrong. I know that's hard to believe, but truly, it's always wrong because it's about us. It's about how our brain works. It's about our experiences. So it's often grossly wrong, but even when it's just partially wrong, or it is wrong in the nuances and details, that can have a big impact on good communication. So let's talk about how to have the real conversation. First of all, we want to understand our assumptions and our interpretations. There's a little bit of an exercise in here. We need to sit down and we need to really say, what's frustrating me about this behavior? What am I having difficulty with? That'll probably point you toward the assumptions and the interpretations that you're making. So are you making the assumption that the person thinks you're lazy or that they don't care? Or, there are all sorts of assumptions that we can make that are really, really ineffective. So you might even write them down. What's the behavior I'm seeing and what are the assumptions I'm making about that? And then you want to set those assumptions aside. The other thing that you want to do is think about how your baggage might be getting tangled up in here. Is the person doing something that your parent used to do to you when you were a kid, devaluing your opinion or something like that, that is, bringing up all this baggage for you. It's good to know that and to be able to be aware of it. Then what you want to do is think about what the right sized piece of this conversation is. If you're having difficulty with someone, you don't have to have the whole conversation at once. It's not how it works. Especially if this is a particularly difficult conversation, it might be too stressful for you to enter that conversation all at once, but there might be a small chunk that you can take off of it and say, instead of addressing all this pattern of behaviors, maybe I'll just address this one today. Those small bite-sized pieces can help you move toward a much better way of communicating with that person and make it a little easier for that other person to take it in as well. During the conversation, you want to stay aware of that baggage. It can be set in the corner. You're not going to get rid of it. It's there. But what you're going to want to do is watch for how it might be impacting your view of the discussion and how it's going, or it might be powering some of those emotions that are coming up. So stay aware of it, set it aside. You're also then going to want to focus on what's happening and describe it clearly and without interpretation or assumption. Remember to stick to your bite-sized piece. This is where you want to consider this a start of transparency and openness with this person. So you don't need to have the conversation all at once. And it can feel really, really hard when somebody throws sort of everything they've ever thought of you at you at once. So you want to consider that other person as well. As you're describing the behavior or the actual issue, you want to describe it clearly and, as I said, without assumptions. The next piece is interesting because you want to describe the impact. So this is where, instead of those assumptions and interpretations, you express how it feels for you. Let me give you an example. You're actually changing your interpretations into impacts. So for example, you could say to your boss, you're a micromanager and you obviously don't trust me to do a good job. Now, you probably wouldn't say that to your boss, but you certainly might think it. So here's how a conversation could go instead. You could say, I notice that you give a lot of direction on work that I am doing on a regular basis. And it leads me to feel like you're having trouble trusting that I'm going to do my work well. Do you see how you've moved it from being an interpretation to being an impact on you? And it's very constructive, right? There's a place you can go from there. And then what you want to do after you share what you're noticing and what the impact is, or the perceived impact, then you want to ask, I notice that you give me a lot of direction in my work that I already know really well, and it leads me to feel like you're having trouble trusting me to do my work well. Is that what's happening? Or what's happening for you? That inquiry is really opening up the conversation. So you want to hear the other person, you want to take in what they're saying, and really have an engaged conversation with them. At some point, you're going to wrap up that conversation, and it might feel a little bit weird sometimes. You might worry about how they took it, worry about where your relationship is at after that. If it was a difficult conversation, you might check back with them casually. It doesn't need to be a big thing, but thanks for the conversation. Let me know if you need a follow-up, something like that. It can also be helpful to insert a small social nicety after a difficult conversation. So if you're meeting up in the real world, that could be bringing them a coffee. If it's virtually, you might make a small gesture, like if you know that they're crazy about alpacas, you might send them a picture of an alpaca that you thought was particularly cute and let them know you thought it would brighten their day. These are these small actions that sort of say, like, I know we had a tough conversation, but we're okay, right? And they can really go a long way to maintaining that relationship. It doesn't mean you have to go overboard. You don't need to send flowers. It's just something small that kind of says, thinking about you, or, grateful for you, or whatever. Are you avoiding having the real conversation? If you are, go to the link in my bio and book a 30-minute introductory coaching session. Get some free coaching on how to get you through it. I hope this is helpful. As always, I would love to hear from you. Please comment, please send me a message.